The first time I heard it, the ice itself seemed to listen. The dogs stopped mid-howl, steam feathering from their muzzles in the blue February dark, and a thin voice rose from beneath the floe, low and coaxing, speaking Greenlandic with a child's cadence where no child could stand, only a black lead opening and closing like a breathing mouth. Men had asked me to set this down, though my hand trembled even now. If you would have such accounts endure, give your favor, mark your name below, and keep company with those who still listen to old ice and older tales. It began 3 weeks earlier, on the 10th of February 1898, when we left Upernavik with the sledges light and our spirits lighter still, for the seals were said to be thick along the edge of Melville Bay. I served then as assistant to Captain Holm, a Danish trader of 50 years, hard about the mouth yet kindly with the men when they did not shirk. And the ice charts from Copenhagen lay folded in his inner coat like another, sterner heart. There were 4 of us upon the main sledge. Holm, myself, a young Greenlander named Eivik, who handled the dogs, and old Mikkel, whose face was as seamed as the floe, and who boasted that he knew every crack between Upernavik and Cape York. 2 smaller sledges followed with hunters and gear, 10 men in all, rifles wrapped in sealskin, harpoons lashed down, lamp oil in tin canisters, a brass sextant in its wooden case, and enough biscuit, pemmican and tobacco for 6 hard weeks on the bay. The air lay clear and painfully cold around -20, the stars brittle above us, and the dogs ran well upon the hard winter surface that rang under the runners like iron. That first night upon the fast ice, when the lanterns sputtered low in the snow house we had cut for ourselves, Holm passed his pipe around, and the tobacco made a little haze that seemed almost luxurious in that clean, killing air. Mikkel spoke of his wife at Godhavn, who waited with failing eyes for one more summer of open water. And Eivik, scarcely older than 20, told me in a low voice that he meant to buy bright cloth for his sister if the hunt were good. Holm listened with that grave little smile of his, and then asked me, in his Danish turned careful for their ears, whether my own father still lived in Aalborg, and whether my mother had forgiven me for choosing ice over trade. I lied then, and said that she had, because the ice at least kept silence and did not scold. And the men laughed a little, their breath white in the narrow space. That night, I woke once to what I took for the distant yelp of a fox out upon the floe, thin and questioning, yet it crossed our camp twice against the wind and set the nearest dogs to whining with their noses pressed to the snow. In the morning, I mentioned it to Mikkel as we harnessed, and he spat thoughtfully upon the snow and said only that sometimes the ice spoke, and that the best course was to pull well away from any place where it had found a tongue. For several days thereafter, our passage north went as these journeys usually did, with the crack of the whip, the grunt of men at the traces when the slope bit too sharply, the clean report of rifles over leads crowded with basking seals, and the measured ticking of Holm's chronometer each evening as he checked our dead reckoning by the dim stars. We slept in snow houses or beneath the upturned sledges when time pressed, ate our rations with the steady hunger of work, and spoke in low voices of prices for skins at Gottorp, and of the rumours that a Norwegian, Nansen, had crossed the very roof of the world some years before. If there were oddities then, they lay small upon the surface of our days, like thin cracks that one stepped across without thought. A whale seen moving far under ice too thick for any breath hole, a tide that fell silent for an hour, the dogs refusing once to drink from a black lead that steamed faintly, though the air froze hair in the nostrils. On the 16th of February, we camped near a pressure ridge some 10 feet high. The shattered line of ice blocks tinted green and blue, and in the morning, Evik found a set of prints along its base that were neither of man nor of any beast that he knew. They ran in a straight, unhurried file from the black water up onto the hard snow, each mark long and narrow as a man's forearm, pressed deep at the heel as though some weight hung behind. And after 20 paces, they faded quite away upon a level patch where no drift had fallen. While we bent over these puzzling signs, Holmes' pocket compass, which had hung from his coat by a thong, snapped its glass with a sharp report as if struck. The needle spasmed twice and then lay fixed toward the pressure ridge instead of north. We all heard that brittle crack clearly, louder in the cold air than such a small thing had any right to be, and for a moment no one spoke. Even the dogs ceased their restless jingling and watched the ridge with ears pricked. Then Holm gave a short laugh and said that frost could play tricks with brass and glass alike, and he ground the broken instrument beneath his heel until the face turned white with powdered crystal. Still, as we moved off, Evik kept glancing back at the ridge, and once I saw his lips move in a prayer to the spirits of the water that he thought I could not hear. 2 nights later, the wind fell away entirely, leaving the world so still that the smoke from our primus rose in a straight grey column and seemed loath to disperse. And as we lay wrapped in our furs, I became aware that I could no longer hear the familiar groan and creak of the pack ice shifting in the dark. The silence pressed faintly in the ears, like water over the head, and once I lifted my hand from my blanket just to hear the rasp of cloth as proof that some sound yet remained in the world. Out of that silence, the voice rose. It seemed at first to be a child somewhere upon the ice outside, piping in Greenlandic, calling a name that I later understood to be Ivik's sister's, and the syllables came muffled as though from under a heavy quilt, and yet each was clear to my ear inside the snow house. Beside me, I felt Ivik's whole body go rigid, though he lay under his own furs, and his breath stopped in his chest until the call died away, after which he began at once to murmur something under his breath that I did not understand. The dogs outside whined, yet not as they did for bears or foxes, but in a low, keening fashion that I had heard once before when a man slipped through rotten ice and was lost before a rope could be cast. In the morning, the world resumed its customary sounds, but Ivik's eyes were red, and when I asked lightly who walked the ice with our names in his mouth, he answered only, "Not he," and refused to say more. That day we saw scarcely any seals, though the sky remained clear and the wind moderate, conditions that should have favoured the hunt, and twice the dogs, without cause that we could see, threw themselves sideways in their traces to avoid narrow belts of otherwise ordinary-looking snow. Where their paws had hesitated, the surface appeared faintly glazed, as if a skin of different ice lay there, and when Mikkel thrust his harpoon butt into it, the sound was not of snow, but of something sodden and resistant below. He withdrew the shaft quickly, and a smell came up, slight but unmistakable in that clear air, a mingling of stale seaweed and something human, like damp wool that had lain too long upon a sweating back. Holm cursed and ordered that we move westward toward the open water, seeing no profit in lingering about such odd patches. and the subject might have fallen away, had not Ivik, walking beside my sledge, said softly that the smell reminded him of old tales the elders told children in winter. He would not tell me then what those tales contained, save to remark that not everything that lived in the water loved the deep alone. By the end of February, we had reached a region of loosely packed floes, where the sea showed darkly between them, and the constant distant thunder of breaking ice became our customary music. Njholm wished to push still farther north to take advantage of an unusually open lane that his chart suggested would not last, though Mikkel muttered that we had come far enough and that the bay had already shown us more humour than was wholesome. On the night of the 1st of March, we made our camp upon a floe some 50 yards across, high-sided and seemingly sound, with a low hummocked ridge to the east that sheltered us a little from the wind. That was the night when matters ceased to seem like scattered oddities and gathered themselves into one design. The wind died toward midnight, and a strange softness came into the cold, as though the air thickened with unseen breath. I woke to the dogs again, but this time they made no sound at all instead. Their chains rattled and scraped, and I heard claws tearing at wood. When I crawled from my blankets, the snow walls of our shelter glowed faintly with moonlight, and beyond Holm's shoulder, at the entrance, there lay a band of darkness, as if the night pressed right up against the cut block. He pushed it aside, and we stepped out. The lantern upon the upturned sledge burned with a thin, sickle-shaped flame that leaned hard toward the western lip of the floe. There the snow had indeed fallen away, leaving a strip of bare ice no wider than a man's height, and upon that ice lay water in a narrow crescent, rippling faintly though no wind stirred. The dogs had backed as far as their traces allowed, chains taut, bodies pressed away from that strip as if from fire, but every head turned sideways toward it, white showing all around their eyes. The smell met us at once, rank and heavy, seaweed and sealskin, and something that belonged to men, but only as sweat belongs to a shirt long worn and never washed. As we watched, the little sickle of water thickened and grew, and the ice beneath it rose, not cracked, but bulging smoothly upward, until it formed a low dome clear as green glass. A pale shape moved within. It came closer, flattening against the inner side, and I saw then a face that I have never wholly forgotten. It was flat, as if drowned, the nose spread wide, the mouth too long for its head, the lips drawn back a little to show square, human teeth. The skin shone pale as the underside of a seal, with a greenish cast, and where I expected lids there were none, only round black eyes that looked out without blinking, and, I knew at once, without haste. Those eyes took in Holm with his rifle, Mikkel clutching the lantern, Ivik shaking so hard that the traces at his belt rattled, and me standing foolishly bareheaded in the killing cold. Long hands, or fins, or something between the two, slid up along the under edge of the floe, feeling as a tailor might feel a hem he meant to pull. The ice under my boots lifted very slightly with that unseen weight, and in that moment, my understanding of solid and void wavered. Holm shouted something wordless and fired point blank into the bulging dome. The report tore the night, the lantern went out, and for a heartbeat, the only light was the red ghost of the muzzle flash upon my eyes. Then the floe itself cried out, a high, tearing sound, and the westward edge broke away in a jagged line. The dogs went mad. I remember chains snapping, bodies flinging themselves forward, a confusion of dark forms vanishing toward the hummocked ridge. Mikkel seized my coat and dragged me bodily toward the center of the flow, as a black tongue of water licked inward where the edge had been. In that chaos, I heard another sound that froze me more surely than the air. The same small voice that had called in the night, piping now from the water's edge, calling again the name of Ivik's sister with a coaxing rise at the end, as though promising warmth. I did not see what answered it, only felt the drag on the ice lessen, and then the breaking ceased. We hitched the remaining dogs in feverish haste and drove off that floe without rest, crossing heaving cracks in the dark by the faint light of a rekindled lantern. Behind us, the floe that had carried us split once more with a hollow boom, and a low mist rose from its broken edge as if something exhaled. Not one man spoke for an hour. When at last we halted upon older, grey ice, Holm's beard had frozen solid with his breath, and even he remarked that there was no profit in further northing. We turned south the next day. The journey back weighed far more heavily upon us than the outward road. The dogs, once eager, now started at every small noise. Twice, in clear weather, a sudden fog rose out of calm water and ringed our little caravan in a white wall through which no sound seemed to pass. Once we found the leather traces of the second sledge partly gnawed through during the night, though no dog had been loosed and no tracks marked the snow about us. Ivik grew thin and grey. Each evening, before we cut snow blocks, he went alone to the nearest lead and laid a small offering of meat upon the ice, murmuring in his own tongue. When I asked whether such gifts brought favour, he answered, "Not favour, distance." We came in sight of the dark rock of Upernavik on the 20th of March, the sea at its foot clogged with late ice, the Danish flag limp above the trading post. Our arrival caused more curiosity than welcome, for men had not expected us so soon, nor from that quarter. Holm made his formal report in the factor's room, the stove iron glowing red. His rifle leaned carefully against the wall. He spoke of thin ice, treacherous tides, some unusual splitting of floes, the loss of one sledge team into a pressure crack that I knew had never opened. Of the prince, the voice, the face under the ice, he said nothing. When the factor, a narrow man with spectacles, asked whether any polar bears had been seen, Holm answered stiffly that we had found sign of something in the water that did not yet appear in his books, and that he advised moving the spring sealing farther south for a season. The factor laughed, a dry paper sound, and remarked that the sea held enough known dangers. It fell to me to write the brief account that went to Copenhagen with the summer ship. I set down the dates, the number of skins taken, the course altered on account of unstable ice. I wrote that the dogs had grown uneasy and that certain mists rose unexpectedly from open leads, and I hinted, as far as my pen dared, that the Greenlanders remained unwilling to hunt that stretch of Melville Bay. Of the face, I wrote nothing. Who would have believed it, set in printer's type between figures for oil and baleen? Even as my nibs scratched the paper, I wondered whether I myself had seen only the night's malice, madness born of cold and tiredness. Yet some things resisted forgetfulness. In the second winter after, when I had gone south as far as Godthorpe, I met Mikkel again in the trading room there. His wife had died, he told me, and he meant to make one more journey north before his eyes failed. We sat on a bale of rope and spoke quietly while the clerk counted skins at the table. Without prompting, he said, "You remember the thing under the ice?" He did not ask whether I had seen anything at all. He assumed it. When I nodded, he added only, "That was not for us. It was for the young one." By that I knew he meant not himself, nor me, but Ivik, who had indeed fallen sick soon after our return and gone to his ancestors before the summer. Was it chance that the voice had called his sister's name from under the floe? I have never been able to answer that to my own satisfaction. Years passed. The world moved on to other marvels. Men flew in machines over seas we had crossed at a crawling pace, and Nansen's name yielded to others. Yet from time to time the bay came back to me, not in dreams of grandeur, but in small, unwelcome visitations. Once, in Aalborg, long after my mother's death, I walked past a quay where cod hung drying from great wooden racks. The wind shifted and a smell came down, thick and heavy, fish oil and damp wool, and the faint sourness of many bodies long confined. My hands began to shake so that I spilled my pipe tobacco onto the cobbles, and I found my eyes fixed upon the black water between the pilings, waiting absurdly for a pale dome to rise. Another time, in 1912, I attended a lecture at the university where a learned man spoke of Arctic folklore. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the Greenlanders spoke of a being called Qallupilluk, or Qallupilluk, which dwelt near the edge of the sea ice and called to children in their own voices. Some said it wore eider skins and a topknot of hair, some that it waited beneath overhanging floes, listening. The students smiled at this nursery terror. The lecturer smiled with them. I did not. I sat at the back, fingers clenched on my knees, and thought of a thin voice in the February dark calling a girl's name, and of eyes beneath ice that had no whites at all. The lecturer's lantern hissed softly as it consumed its oil, and when he spoke of superstition yielding to science, I wondered whether knowledge had ever truly reached the underside of those northern floes. Once, in later years, I returned to Greenland in a small capacity on a coastal vessel. We lay off Upernavik for 2 days in bad weather, and from the deck, I watched the broken spring ice drift past in slow rafts. The men aboard spoke of wireless messages and tonnage. The officers checked their charts. None of them looked long at the ice. I found that I could not bring myself to ask any hunter whether voices still rose from Melville Bay, or whether children still heard their names called from the water. Perhaps I feared an eager denial more than a quiet assent. I have held fast all my life to the uses of reason, to sextant and chart, to soundings honestly taken. Yet there remains for me that strip of ice on a March night, when the wind died, the air thickened with unseen breath, and the old distinctions between what lay above the floe and what lay beneath it ceased to comfort. Was the thing we saw a creature of flesh, some unknown seal or fish distorted by our fear? Was it a form moulded by our own minds out of rank smell and mist and old stories? I cannot say. What I know is that it watched us with a patience that felt older than our little caravan, older than our trade, perhaps older than the names we gave to that bay. In the end, I came to accept that there are places where the world keeps its own counsel, and where our reports, our charts, our careful lines of ink are no more than the scratchings of men on a snow block that the tide will take. The disturbing detail that remains with me is not the flat, drowned face, nor the long, pale hands. It is that sense. Now as the lantern's flame, leaned toward the flow's lip, that something under the ice had already weighed us, chosen which of us it wanted, and found no need to hurry. On winter evenings now, when the stove ticks and the wind rattles the shutter of my little room, I sometimes hear the dogs of Upernavik in the gusts, and beneath them, fainter still, a child's voice calling patiently from somewhere just beyond the wall, as if the house itself floated on a dark, unseen sea.